and welcome to our 12th lecture and the last in this section on the neurobiology of addiction, how we go from use and abuse to addiction. We'll start off talking a little bit about that and then talk about the epigenetics of addiction and drug use, and then finally finish up with some potential pharmacotherapy of substance use disorders. So let's start about talking about how we go from abuse to addiction. Generally, it starts with repeated drug use, can develop into a chronic drug use that can become compulsive and result in addiction. It won't always, and that's something we have to consider, that not everyone will become addicted to a drug if they use it. Regular use and chronic use, however, makes that more likely. The frontal lobe can be profoundly altered by chronic drug abuse, and in particular, our ability to control and resist drug cues. We do see some cortical hypofrontality. Simply means we see reductions in the frontal lobe and frontal lobe density and volume. This occurs generally after long-term drug use, and so it's one of the things we want to try to avoid is long-term use of any of these drugs of abuse. We also see fewer dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens than normal, and a lower metabolic rate in the frontal lobe. And so that sees a general slowing down of our ability to engage in executive functioning, working memory, judge risk, resist drug-related cues, and also it means that we get less reward from natural rewards, things like food, water, sex, love, that sort of thing. So if we see, we take a look at dopamine receptor availability in the frontal lobes, and again, this is right in that sort of nucleus accumbens area. You can see reduced dopamine receptor availability in these areas in this PET scan. So the way this PET scan works is it binds to those dopamine receptors. You can see pretty significant reduction in those dopamine receptors in this particular case. So here's a basic overview of how we kind of can go from abuse to addiction. So as a result of chronic drug use, those natural rewards become less pleasurable. We get less dopamine response, despite greater responses in the dopaminergic transmission than normal. The frontal cortex becomes less active, less responsive to normal rewards, but is overreactive to drugs or the stimuli that predict drugs, so those drug-related cues are particularly important. The memories of positive effects of drugs and maybe what occurred during those drug use times, you were out with friends, had great sex, whatever it is that you were doing under that drug use, is also part of that motivation for compulsive use. Of course, also that memory includes that high. That can also be responsible for relapse. And that memory is then mediated by both the amygdala and the hippocampus. Over time, those cues that we talked about earlier produce greater responses in the reward pathway than rewarding stimuli themselves. And we talked about that as well in the previous lecture. This then elicits craving sensations, and then finally the frontal lobes become sensitized to drug-related stimuli and over-respond to those stimuli. So then part of the biological process of developing craving involves glutamatergic substrates of addiction. What happens is we get hypersensitivity in the frontal lobes to drugs or those drug-related cues. So again, this is about learning. This is basic first principles of psychology. This is, B.F. Skinner at his finest, where we basically associated cues with rewards, and that develops into addiction. And this is the basis of craving, because we crave that reward, we crave that feeling. Craving is biologically mediated as increased glutamatergic reactivity within that reward circuit we talked about in the previous lecture. So that craving is part of this reward pathway. Not necessarily the dopamine release, because that's the reward, but the craving for that reward is mediated by this glutamatergic activity in the reward circuit. So chronic use can produce some common biochemical changes across drugs. Delta phos-B is a protein that accumulates in the nucleus accumbens after chronic cocaine, amphetamine, opiates, alcohol, nicotine, cannabinoids, phenylcyclidine or PCP. This protein accumulates in the nucleus accumbens and cause significant changes. Now, delta phos-B also accumulates after chronic natural rewards, but not in the levels that it accumulates after drug use. This contributes to the sensitization to drugs and drug-related cues. So these behavior responses to cocaine, opioids, opiates, I know I'll get that out eventually, is because of this buildup of delta phosphate. This also increases sugar consumption. So oftentimes people who are addicts or have used quite a bit of drugs crave sugar. The induction of delta phosphate mediates some common aspects of drug and natural addictions by regulating a set of common target genes. And so this is genetic regulation. And here in a moment, we're going to talk about epigenetic alterations based on drug use and how that might be changing the target genes and the way they are responding. And so this is not just a change in receptor availability, but also in the genetic expression of neurons within the brain. Finally, several drugs of abuse also are known to reduce neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is the creation of new neurons in the hippocampus and the frontal lobes and other areas that is certainly related to depression and depression-related behaviors. We will talk a great deal about neurogenesis when we get to talking about depression later on in the term. So one of the big fields of research right now is in understanding epigenetics, or how our experiences can alter our genetic expression. And studies suggest that overall heritability of addiction is moderate to high. And so oftentimes, if your parents, grandparents were addicts, you may be at greater risk. So we start looking at how those genetics and our environment may interplay with one another. We now know that genes are a part of the picture, they're not the entire picture. That is, your DNA sequence that you're born with sets up perhaps the ability for an addiction, but not that it will actually happen. Other things might need to happen, stress, etc. So, need to get a little bit of detail out, and this is sort of digging down in a little deep into how epigenetics work. We'll start with a little bit about the structure of the genome. We have what's called chromatin. These are histones and DNA together. These histones then are spools of protein around which strands of DNA are wound, and that spool or winding of histones is an important part of understanding epigenetics. Because if the histone is tightly wound, that gene won't express. But if we get histone modulation or moderation, we might get that gene to express. A nucleosome then is 8 histones plus about 160 base pairs of DNA. And so a nucleosome might be a target for us trying to understand how drugs might change our epigenetics. So let's kind of walk through this. Up here on the top, we have some epigenetic mechanisms that include things like aging, development, diet, drugs and pharmaceuticals, environmental chemicals. We'll also talk about things like exercise, sleep, stress as being epigenetic mechanisms. Now, what might happen because of those mechanisms could be an autoimmune disease, cancer, diabetes, different mental disorders, depression, schizophrenia, etc. So there are two processes we should think about or try to at least understand the basis of that are epigenetic processes: DNA methylation and histone modification. We'll start with DNA methylation. DNA methylation then is a chemical process that can add a methyl group to DNA. That's just simply a carbon and 3 hydrogen atoms. Basic organic chemistry. This process, however, can alter the expressions of genes, either activating or repressing them. And so remember, genetic expression is how proteins are created, and it's a really important part of how our memories are formed or stored. So this change in DNA expression and protein expression is an important consideration in terms of how drugs might be affecting the brain. The other epigenetic factors are biochemical molecules that bind to these histone tails. When they're attached to histone tails, these epigenetic factors affect how tightly the DNA molecule is wound around the histone, as I said a minute ago. So DNA that's wound very tightly is not easily activated. DNA that's more loosely wound is more easily activated. So anything that modifies this histone winding might make it more active or less active depending on which way it's modified. So DNA methylation and histone modification are the two primary processes by which these genetic expressions are changed. Excuse me. So these are the biochemical mechanisms of epigenetic processes: methylation, acetylation, phosphorylation, ubiquitination, and simylation. These are all different biochemical processes that can alter the genetic expression of cells. So how do epigenetic processes occur under normal conditions? When histones are tightly compacted, those genes are hidden and not exposed, not expressed. To turn these genes on, that is to read them or express them, to make them create proteins or whatever it is that they're creating, or off, the structure of the chromatin itself has to be altered. And so when the structure of chromatin is altered, it will alter whether or not a DNA sequence is expressing or not, generating proteins or not. And so this is an important part of how we learn. This is an important part of how our brain functions, and this is occurring all the time. These genes are getting turned on and off all of the time. And so this is an important part of this process. So to give you an idea about a fairly simple epigenetic alteration is the ability to process dairy. And so you have to produce an enzyme called lactase to process dairy, and people who are lactose intolerant no longer express that gene. And in fact, it wasn't until we managed to domesticate cattle and goats that we were able to even leave that gene on for longer periods of time. And so that is an epigenetic alteration. So some psychiatric implications of epigenetics. This is an early, relatively young field, so we're still determining a lot about this. Certainly some diseases have epigenetic etiologies: Prader-Willi syndrome, Angelman syndrome, and Rett syndrome. This is a hot topic in cancer research, so both epigenetics and pharmacogenetics are big areas in cancer treatment. There's questions about Alzheimer's disease and whether or not it might be an epigenetic alteration. And certainly there is some solid evidence that schizophrenia might be an epigenetic alteration that could be caused by something like a virus or an allergy or exposure to some sort of environmental incident. So all of these potentially have epigenetic alterations. So when it comes to drugs of abuse, we know that multiple drugs of abuse can induce changes in histone acetylation, including cocaine, alcohol, and cannabis. And we know that stress may also play a role in epigenetic changes. And so it might be the combination of stress and drug abuse that leads people more likely to go down the path of addiction. And so this is a fascinating area where we're just really starting to get a handle on how all of this works. So that gets us then to some pharmacotherapies of substance use disorders. The first way we can treat a substance use disorder is with an agonist substitution treatment. And this is where we prescribe a substitute drug for the abused agent. So in the case of opioid addiction, we might prescribe methadone, or buprenorphine is a newer partial agonist. With nicotine addiction, we might provide substitute nicotine. We can also use a drug called varenicline to treat nicotine addiction that actually alters the response to nicotine. And then finally, with alcohol addiction, disulfiram, which is Antabuse. So partial agonist substitution treatment is what I was just alluding to. Buprenorphine is a partial agonist for opiate addiction, combined with naloxone. It's often called Subutex, which is a really terrific treatment. And we'll talk about buprenorphine, naloxone combinations as a great treatment for opiate addiction when we get to talking about opiates. Varenicline, as I was just saying, is an alpha-4 beta-2 partial nicotinic agonist. And the brilliant part about varenicline is that people can still smoke while they're taking it, and they just cut down their nicotine use because they stop having those nicotine cravings. And so usually about a month or so of varenicline or Chantix is sufficient for treating nicotinic addiction. Now, unfortunately, there also is a genotype of people who don't respond to varenicline because of alterations in that alpha-4 beta-2 nicotinic receptor. Dopamine partial agonists are on the horizon. We think maybe modafinil might be useful for this particular case. This should provide enough dopamine activation to reduce the effects of withdrawal, but block the consequences of illicit stimulant use. And that's a tough call to find something that can do that. And so work goes on in this particular area. Antagonists as treatments for addiction, these directly block the reinforcing effect and eventually reduce the compulsive behavior. Naloxone is the active component of Narcan. And so because this is a complete opiate antagonist, it will reverse the effects of an overdose relatively quickly. The problem is because it completely reverses the effects of the opiates, people go instantly into withdrawal. Because they're not getting any kind of reinforcement, it makes adherence difficult and relapse likely. So combining naloxone with buprenorphine, they get a little bit of that reinforcement, but also then if they abuse, again, they get no effect from the drug of abuse because of the presence of the naloxone. Couple areas also looking at are non-dopaminergic neurotransmitter systems like the GABAergic system. The GABA B agonists, such as baclofen, can reduce the reinforcing effects of several different classes of abused drugs. Other GABAergic medications are being tested as possible agents for preventing cocaine relapse and are anticonvulsants. Finally, we're getting into the era where we might be able to develop vaccines for relapse prevention. These would stimulate the production of drug-specific antibodies. And so essentially we're getting the body's immune system to go after the drug molecules. And so those drug molecules don't make it to the brain, and as a result, you don't get high, and that decreases further use. All right, well, that is the end of our discussion of underlying causes of addiction. We will return next time with the discussions of alcohol.